In 1896, a European army marched into Africa expecting an easy conquest. They had modern rifles, artillery, and the arrogance of an empire that had never lost to an African force. 8 hours later, 7,000 of them lay dead in the mountains, and the world's entire understanding of African military power shattered in a single day. The Battle of Adwa wasn't just a victory. It was the moment when one African emperor proved that European colonization wasn't inevitable, that African kingdoms could stand against the most advanced militaries on Earth, and that the narrative of European supremacy was built on nothing more than propaganda and luck. This isn't a feel-good myth or an exaggerated legend. This is documented history that colonial powers tried desperately to bury, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why this single battle terrified every colonial empire in Europe and inspired resistance movements across 3 continents. Our story begins in the 1880s, in a continent being carved up like a feast. Picture the scene. In ornate conference rooms in Berlin, European diplomats are literally drawing lines on maps of Africa with rulers and pencils, dividing an entire continent among themselves without a single African voice in the room. They called it the scramble for Africa, and by 1890, nearly 90% of the continent had been claimed by European powers. The British controlled vast territories from Cairo to Cape Town. The French dominated West and Central Africa. The Germans, Belgians, and Portuguese all grabbed their pieces. The rules of this scramble were brutally simple. If you could plant a flag and defend it with guns, the territory was yours. But there was one problem on this map of conquered territories, one inconvenient reality that the Europeans kept running into. In the Horn of Africa, high in the mountains where the Blue Nile begins its journey to Egypt, there stood an independent African empire that refused to be conquered. Ethiopia, not a colony, not a protectorate. A sovereign nation with an unbroken imperial lineage stretching back thousands of years, with its own written language, its own Christian church established in the 4th century, and its own fierce tradition of military resistance. While other African kingdoms fell to European guns, Ethiopia's mountainous terrain and warrior culture had kept invaders at bay for centuries. Here's what made Ethiopia different from nearly every other African territory facing colonization. They had spent decades watching what happened to their neighbors. They saw how the British used superior firepower to crush the Zulu kingdom. They witnessed the French systematically conquering West African states. They understood that traditional spears and shields couldn't stop modern rifles and artillery. And so, while other African leaders either underestimated the European threat or couldn't acquire modern weapons fast enough, Ethiopia's leaders made a calculated decision that would change everything. They would beat the Europeans at their own game. Enter Emperor Menelik II, a man whose strategic genius is still studied in military academies today. Born in 1844, Menelik had spent years as a political prisoner before becoming Emperor of Ethiopia in 1889. That experience taught him patience, strategic thinking, and the absolute necessity of understanding your enemy. Menelik didn't just want to preserve Ethiopian independence through military strength. He wanted to build a modern nation that could stand as an equal to any European power. He established schools, modernized the government, and most importantly, he understood that the future of African independence would be decided by whoever controlled the weapons of modern warfare. But Menelik wasn't working alone. Beside him stood Empress Taytu Bitul, a political mastermind whose intelligence network and diplomatic skills were legendary. While European colonial powers dismissed African women as powerless, Taytu was building one of the most sophisticated spy networks in the Horn of Africa, gathering intelligence on Italian military movements, diplomatic communications, and strategic plans. Contemporary accounts describe her as brilliant, uncompromising, and absolutely dedicated to Ethiopian sovereignty. She would prove to be as crucial to Ethiopia's victory as any general on the battlefield. Imagine standing in the Ethiopian highlands in 1889, watching caravans arriving at the capital carrying crates upon crates of modern weapons. Menelik had been secretly purchasing rifles, artillery, and ammunition from multiple European sources, playing different powers against each other. He bought weapons from the French, who were happy to undermine Italian colonial ambitions. He purchased arms from the Russians, who saw Ethiopia as a Christian ally in a Muslim-dominated region. He even acquired weapons from the Italians themselves, who foolishly believed they were arming a future puppet state. By the mid-1890s, Ethiopia possessed one of the largest stockpiles of modern weapons in Africa, and Menelik had been quietly training a massive army in how to use them. But to understand how this army came to face the Italian Empire on a mountain battlefield in 1896, we need to go back to the treaty that started it all. The year was 1889, and Italy was late to the colonial game. While Britain and France had been building empires for decades, Italy had only recently unified as a nation and was desperate to claim its place among the great powers. The Italians had established a colony in Eritrea, on the Red Sea coast north of Ethiopia, and they wanted more. They wanted Ethiopia itself, but they knew they couldn't simply invade. The Ethiopian army was too strong, the terrain too difficult, so they tried something more insidious. They offered Menelik a treaty of friendship and cooperation. The Treaty of Wuchel seemed straightforward enough. Italy would recognize Menelik as Emperor of Ethiopia. Ethiopia would receive Italian support and assistance. Both nations would respect each other's sovereignty. Menelik signed the Amharic version of the treaty in May 1889, believing he had secured a beneficial alliance. But here's the fascinating part. The Italian version of the same treaty contained a slight difference in translation, a difference that would provide Italy with the legal justification for claiming Ethiopia as a protectorate. In the Amharic version, Article 17 stated that Ethiopia could use Italian diplomatic channels for international relations if they chose to do so, optional cooperation between allies. But in the Italian version, that same article stated that Ethiopia must conduct all foreign relations through Italy, mandatory submission to Italian control. This wasn't a translation error. This was calculated deception. The Italians immediately began telling other European powers that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate, that Menelik had voluntarily surrendered his nation's sovereignty, and that Italy had the right to represent Ethiopian interests in international affairs. Picture Menelik's reaction when he discovered this betrayal. Contemporary chroniclers reported that he was furious, but he didn't act rashly. Instead, he did something that demonstrated his strategic brilliance. He publicly denounced the treaty in 1893, sending letters to every major European power declaring that Ethiopia was fully independent and that the Italian translation was fraudulent. He invited European observers to come to Ethiopia and see for themselves that this was a sovereign nation, not an Italian colony. And then he began preparing for the war he knew was coming. What happened next would demonstrate the power of preparation, intelligence gathering, and national unity against colonial aggression. Menelik sent messengers throughout Ethiopia with a call to arms that historians still consider one of the most effective mobilizations in African history. He didn't just summon his own troops. He called upon every regional leader, every provincial army, every warrior culture in Ethiopia to unite against the Italian threat. This wasn't just about defending the emperor. This was about defending Ethiopia itself, about proving that an African nation could stand against European colonization. The response was unprecedented. Over the following months, armies began converging on the highlands from every corner of Ethiopia. Warriors from Tigray in the north, cavalry from Shua in the center, riflemen from regions across the empire, all marching toward what would become the largest mobilization of African military forces against a European colonial power in history. By early 1896, Menelik had assembled an army of over 100,000 soldiers. Not all of them had modern rifles, but enough did to match European firepower, and all of them carried something the Italians would fatally underestimate: they were fighting for their homeland. But the real genius of Menelik's strategy wasn't just assembling a massive army. It was the intelligence operation run by Empress Teydu. Her network of spies had infiltrated Italian military communications. She knew their troop movements, their supply lines, their strategic plans. When the Italian commander, General Orst Baratieri, began moving his forces deeper into Ethiopian territory in early 1896, Menelik knew exactly where they were going and how many soldiers they had. The Italians thought they were conducting a surprise campaign. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. This brings us to February 1896 and the decision that would seal Italy's fate. General Baratieri was under pressure from Rome to achieve a decisive victory. His colonial government was running out of money, his supply lines were stretched thin, and political opponents back in Italy were questioning whether the Ethiopian campaign was worth the cost. He needed a dramatic win to justify the entire colonial enterprise, so he made a fatal choice. He would march his army of approximately 17,000 Italian and Eritrean troops directly toward the Ethiopian positions near the town of Adwa, deep in the highlands, and force a decisive battle that would crush Ethiopian resistance once and for all. Here's where the story becomes almost mythical in its dramatic irony. The Italian army was confident, experienced, and well-armed with modern weapons. They had artillery, machine guns, and the best rifles available, but they had terrible maps of the Ethiopian highlands. They didn't know the terrain. Their communication system between different units was confused and unreliable, and they had absolutely no idea that they were marching toward an Ethiopian army that outnumbered them 6-1 and held every tactical advantage the mountains could provide. The night before the battle, Ethiopian forces took their positions in the mountains surrounding the approaches to Adwa. Menelik's generals understood something that the Italians didn't. In mountainous terrain, numbers and position matter more than technology. If you can surround an enemy force and attack from multiple directions simultaneously, even superior weapons can't save them. The Ethiopian battle plan was sophisticated, coordinated, and designed to exploit every weakness in the Italian position. Multiple armies would strike from different directions, preventing the Italians from concentrating their fire or forming defensive positions. The Italians would be forced to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, in unfamiliar terrain, against an enemy that knew every rock and ravine. If you're still here, this story is about to take a turn that shocked the entire world. What happened on March 1, 1896, didn't just change Ethiopian history. It challenged every assumption about race, military power, and colonial inevitability that European empires had built their dominance upon. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will show you why this battle remains one of the most important military engagements in African history. So stay tuned. When the Battle of Adwa finally happened, nobody could have predicted just how complete the Ethiopian victory would be. Dawn broke over the highlands on March 1, 1896, revealing an Italian army that had already made its first fatal mistake. During the night march toward their intended positions, Italian units had become separated due to those terrible maps and poor communication. Instead of one concentrated force, they were now scattered across the mountain valleys in 3 separate columns, unable to support each other effectively. The Ethiopian forces, watching from the high ground, couldn't have asked for a better situation. The battle began with Ethiopian forces attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. Picture the scene: Italian soldiers suddenly realizing that they're not facing a disorganized mob of spear-carrying warriors, but a coordinated military force with modern rifles, attacking from commanding positions in the mountains. The Italians tried to form defensive squares, the traditional European formation for fighting in colonial wars. But defensive squares work when you're fighting enemies with inferior weapons on open ground. They don't work when you're surrounded in mountains by forces with equivalent firepower and overwhelming numbers. Here's the shocking truth that most histories don't emphasize enough: the Ethiopian forces weren't just brave or numerous. They were tactically superior in that specific engagement. Menelik's generals understood combined arms warfare, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and artillery in ways that maximized their advantages. When Italian units tried to retreat or regroup, Ethiopian cavalry cut off their escape routes. When they tried to form defensive positions, Ethiopian riflemen from the high ground made those positions untenable. The Italians had walked into a killing zone, and there was no way out. Over the following 8 hours, the Battle of Adwa turned into a catastrophic defeat for the Italian forces. One Italian brigade was completely surrounded and annihilated. Another was routed and scattered. The third managed to retreat in something resembling order, but only after suffering devastating casualties. By the time the sun set that evening, approximately 7,000 Italian and Eritrean soldiers lay dead on the battlefield. Another 1,500, including multiple Italian generals, had been captured. The Ethiopian forces had lost between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers, but they held the field. They had won decisively, and they had proven something that would echo across the colonized world. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate military result. The Battle of Adwa was the first time an African army had decisively defeated a European colonial power using modern military tactics and weapons, not a guerrilla victory or a temporary setback that would be reversed later. A complete, undeniable military defeat that forced Italy to abandon its claims on Ethiopia entirely. European newspapers struggled to explain how this had happened. Some tried to downplay Italian military competence. Others claimed it was just bad luck or poor leadership. But the truth was unavoidable. Ethiopian forces had outfought, outmaneuvered, and outgeneraled a European army in open battle. But here's what they don't want you to understand about Adwa's true significance. This wasn't just about one battle or one country. This was about shattering a narrative that had justified European colonization of Africa. European powers had built their colonial projects on the assumption that African peoples and kingdoms were militarily, technologically, and organizationally inferior. That colonization was inevitable because Africans couldn't possibly resist modern European military power. Adwa proved that assumption was a lie. It demonstrated that when African leaders had access to modern weapons, strong leadership, and strategic preparation, they could defeat European armies. The implications terrified every colonial power in Africa. By 1896, as news of the Italian defeat spread across Africa and the world, something remarkable began happening. Colonized and threatened peoples everywhere started seeing Ethiopian resistance as proof that European conquest wasn't inevitable. In West Africa, resistance leaders pointed to Adwa as evidence that Europeans could be beaten. In the Caribbean and Americas, Pan-African thinkers celebrated Ethiopia as a symbol of African capability and dignity. In Europe, anti-colonial activists used Adwa to challenge the moral and practical justifications for imperialism. One battle in the Ethiopian highlands had become a symbol of resistance that transcended borders and continents. The immediate aftermath of the battle forced Italy to completely reverse its colonial policy toward Ethiopia. In October 1896, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa, formally recognizing Ethiopian sovereignty and independence. The fraudulent Treaty of Wuchel was annulled. Italy withdrew its territorial claims. For the first time in the scramble for Africa, a European power had been forced to recognize an African nation as a fully sovereign equal. Menelik had achieved what no other African leader had managed. He had defeated European colonization decisively and secured international recognition of his nation's independence. But the most shocking part of this story is what happened to Ethiopia's legacy over the following decades, and why that legacy matters even more today than it did in 1896. For over 40 years, Ethiopia stood as the only independent African nation, besides Liberia, a living refutation of colonial propaganda about African inferiority. Ethiopian diplomats represented their nation in international forums as equals to European powers. Ethiopian scholars, artists, and leaders became symbols of African achievement and potential. When Marcus Garvey and other Pan-African leaders organized resistance to colonialism and racism, they pointed to Ethiopia as proof that Africans could govern themselves, fight for themselves, and stand as equals in the world community. Here's where the story becomes darker and more complex. Italy never forgot the humiliation of Adwa. For Italian nationalists and fascists, that defeat became a wound that demanded revenge. When Benito Mussolini rose to power in the 1920s, avenging Adwa became a central goal of his imperial ambitions. In 1935, 39 years after the Battle of Adwa, Italy invaded Ethiopia again. This time they came with aircraft, poison gas, and a determination to erase the memory of their earlier defeat through overwhelming brutality. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War was everything Adwa wasn't. Italy used chemical weapons banned by international law. They bombed civilian populations. They committed systematic atrocities designed to break Ethiopian resistance through terror. Emperor Haile Selassie, who had succeeded Menelik, appealed to the League of Nations for help, delivering a speech that warned the world about the dangers of appeasing fascist aggression. But the European powers, consumed with their own political calculations and unwilling to confront Italian aggression, did nothing. Ethiopia fell to Italian occupation in 1936, and for 5 years, Italian forces attempted to crush Ethiopian identity through violent colonial rule. But this wasn't just military revenge. It was calculated erasure of what Ethiopia represented. Italian occupiers destroyed monuments commemorating Adwa. They tried to rewrite Ethiopian history to minimize the 1896 victory. They killed Ethiopian intellectuals, religious leaders, and anyone who might preserve the memory of Ethiopian resistance. This was systematic cultural destruction designed to ensure that Ethiopia could never again serve as a symbol of African capability or resistance to European domination. What Italy couldn't accept was that Adwa had proven African armies could win. So they tried to bury that truth under military occupation and historical revision. Over the following decades, even after Ethiopian forces and British allies expelled Italy in 1941, the global significance of Adwa was often downplayed in Western histories. Colonial powers had no interest in celebrating an African military victory over Europeans. During the Cold War, Ethiopia's importance was measured by its strategic location and alliance choices, not its historical resistance to colonization. Even today, many history curricula in Europe and America barely mention Adwa, despite its enormous significance in challenging colonial narratives and inspiring anti-colonial resistance worldwide. It wasn't until recent decades that historians, particularly African and African diaspora scholars, began recovering the full story of Adwa and insisting on its rightful place in world history. They revealed how Menelik's strategic genius, Taydu's intelligence network, and the coordinated mobilization of Ethiopian forces represented sophisticated military and political organization that contradicted every colonial stereotype about African capabilities. They showed how the Battle of Adwa directly influenced anti-colonial resistance movements across Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond. They demonstrated that Adwa wasn't just an Ethiopian victory, it was a turning point in global consciousness about colonialism, race, and African agency. Today, as we recover and celebrate this history, we're not just learning about one battle or one nation. We're confronting uncomfortable questions about how history gets written, whose victories get remembered, and why certain stories are systematically excluded from dominant narratives. The Battle of Adwa forces us to ask, how many other African victories, achievements, and moments of resistance have been erased or minimized because they challenged colonial narratives? How many other examples of African military, political, and cultural sophistication were deliberately ignored because acknowledging them would undermine the justifications for European domination? Ethiopia's legacy endures in every African nation that achieved independence in the 20th century, in every anti-colonial movement that proved resistance was possible, in every challenge to the racist assumptions that once justified European imperialism. March 1st, the anniversary of the Battle of Adwa, is celebrated across the African diaspora as a day of pride and remembrance. Not just because Ethiopia won a battle, but because that victory demonstrated something the colonial powers desperately wanted to hide. African peoples and nations could organize, fight, and triumph against European military power when given the opportunity and resources to do so. The Battle of Adwa reminds us that greatness can emerge anywhere, that resistance is possible even against overwhelming odds, and that the most significant victories are those that change how people see themselves and their potential. But it also reminds us that even the most magnificent achievements can be erased, distorted, or forgotten if we don't work to preserve and celebrate them. Ethiopia's victory at Adwa didn't just save one nation from colonization. It proved to the entire world that African independence was achievable, that European colonialism wasn't inevitable, and that the narrative of racial and civilizational hierarchy that justified imperialism was built on lies that could be shattered by courage, strategy, and unity. Emperor Menelik II and Empress Taydu Bitul didn't just win a battle. They struck a blow against colonialism itself, proving that African leaders with vision, preparation, and determination could stand as equals to any power on earth. The 100,000 Ethiopian soldiers who marched into those mountains didn't just defend their country. They defended the possibility of African independence and dignity in an era when those things seemed impossible. And the story of their victory continues to inspire resistance to oppression, challenges to dominant narratives, and pride in African achievement more than a century later. If this story opened your eyes to how African resistance shaped world history in ways that are still being recovered and celebrated, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories that challenge what you thought you knew about the past. Let me know in the comments what other African victories and resistance movements you think deserve to have their stories told with the same depth and respect, because the truth is always more incredible than the simplified versions we're taught. The Battle of Adwa isn't just African history or Ethiopian history. It's human history, a story of courage, intelligence, and resistance that belongs to everyone who believes that freedom is worth fighting for and that the powerful don't get to write all the stories. You just have to know where to look for the truth, and you have to be willing to challenge the narratives that try to bury it.